Thank you very much. I'll take you to Matthew Gospel, Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. Jesus cannot be God because he makes a distinction between himself and God, as he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Yeah, so I mean, again, a lot of answers to the questions that Muslims rage, or excuse me, well, I guess that was a Freudian slip. They rage and fulminate certain uh, arguments or questions, and the answer to them often involves the basic distinction that I've already made in answer to previous questions and has to be reiterated to them over and over and over again. In the first place, Christians do not deny that there is a personal distinction between the Father and the Son. So the idea that the Son speaks to or about the Father is not problematic for Christians on that level, right? We do affirm that there is a personal distinction between them. But here they are, moreover, making the argument that Jesus doesn't simply address the Father, the first person of the Trinity, but he addresses him as his God, my God, my God. Well, again, remember, Jesus, according to the Gospels, according to the entire New Testament, is both God and man. Okay, God is the God of all flesh, according to the prophet Jeremiah. Right? He says God is the God of all flesh. In the Psalms, the psalmist says, "My flesh yearns for God." Right? So, as the God of all flesh, Jesus, by virtue of becoming flesh, necessarily enters into that kind of a relationship with the Father that we have towards the Father. Okay? He's not only a divine person, he's also a divine person with a fully human nature, a true human nature. And so, from that perspective, can refer to the Father as his God. And if he couldn't, then we are without hope, because our whole redemption rests upon someone being able to, in our stead, some human being being able to perfectly obey the will of the Father and offer himself as a perfect sacrifice on the cross. Right? So if Jesus couldn't worship and serve God in our stead, then we are without hope, and of all men the most miserable. Right? It doesn't, Muslims think, well, we don't have this problem because we can just dismiss all of this stuff, right? And just say God just forgives us. But that doesn't get rid of the problem. Just because they act like their God can dispense with his justice, as if justice is not essential to his being. He can be fundamentally unjust and just forgive sins without punishing them. Okay, that's not a solution to the problem. Okay, not if you're going to be true to the revelation of God, true to what's necessarily true of God's character. God is who and what he is necessarily and eternally. God is fundamentally just. He can't set aside his justice in order to be loving towards people. So the only way he can be both just and loving is what we see in the Christian gospel, right? Jesus becoming a human being, dying in our place so that God might then be just and the justifier of those who have faith in Jesus, according to Romans 3. Only in this way is God's justice satisfied, and can God be loving towards us without it being at the expense of his justice. Okay, so we require a Savior who could really enter into our human situation, who could therefore really and truly render unto God what we ought to have rendered unto God: complete worship, complete service, perfect obedience. So if Jesus couldn't call upon God as my God and render his life as a sacrifice to him, even under the most grievous conditions, then we have no hope. And so this isn't an argument against Christianity, as I said, because Christians affirm that in becoming flesh, Jesus entered into that kind of a relationship with the Father. The Father, by virtue of the incarnation, also became Jesus's God.
Thank you for that. Let me ask a follow-up question on this verse. Where it says, why have you forsaken me? Why Jesus is feeling God is, or his Father is leaving him?
Yeah, so we would say, ontologically, that's just a fancy term referring to God's. The word ontology refers to the being of anything, right? But in reference to God, ontologically, there was no separation between the Father and the Son. It's not as if the Son's essence somehow became severed from the Father's. Rather, here, what Jesus is expressing is his experience of the divine wrath that was poured out upon him, not because he did anything wrong, but because he's enduring what we ought to have endured. So experientially, Jesus is enduring all that we would have experienced forever in hell, right? He's able to endure this in a finite amount of time on the cross because he's an infinite person, right? So he was able to endure the infinite wrath of God in a finite amount of time because he is an infinite person who has become flesh. And so even though there's no ontological separation here, there is the experience of divine wrath being poured out upon him. And that experience is expressed in a feeling of forsakenness, right? Jesus is really and truly enduring wrath, right? It would be no different than, let's say, this is a, obviously imperfect analogy, but all analogies are, right? Especially when we're talking about God. But if you could imagine, let's say a person is speeding and they get a speeding ticket, and somebody else chooses to pay the fine for them. That person would then technically be enduring the feeling of being at, could. I mean, again, this is imperfect, but there's a sense in which they are accepting, the law. When you violate it, the law frowns upon you, right? The law. I'm here personalizing the law, but the person on the bench, right, is frowning upon you. Well, if somebody steps in to take your debt, well, there's a sense in which you experience that as well, right? You're paying the debt, but you're also, in some sense, you're taking responsibility, aren't you, for what the person did? And so if you can, again, this is a weak analogy, but I'm just trying to help people sort of enter into the idea here. By virtue of Jesus stepping into our place, bearing our guilt, and then bearing the punishment for it, he is, as it were, experiencing what is due to us. Even though there's no fundamental separation between his being, his essential godhood, and the godhood of the Father and the Spirit. So, as the God-man, the incarnate person, he endures the punishment, which is God-forsakenness.